So there are several questions about rice. So I would like to include number 45, which we skipped earlier on. So I would be asking 4 questions together. Would that be okay?
Me out with these questions, and I'll point out firstly that rice is not covered by the produce safety regulation because it is a grain.
So if that's the case, so then it would be number 57. So the rice fields is being exempt. So is it okay to understand that the observation of CGMP would be the basics?
Question.
Farms are not subject to CGMPs. They don't apply till the food enters a facility. There are some activities with rice that are conducted in facilities where the preventive controls for human foods rule would apply, including the CGMPs.
Okay, thank you. So number 58 in the second half. So polished rice, is this covered by PCHF? Excuse me. So let me skip that. Understood. No, please don't skip that one. Please ask him. Number 58. Okay, so number 58. So steps for rice drying and rice threshing in a farm, including that of agricultural cooperatives, are exempt from PCHF since they are not acts of processing, but work associated with harvesting and storing. Rice milling is subject to PCHF. Is this correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yes.
So number 59, regarding green tea, this will be asked later with other questions related to tea. Number 60, a simple cutting and packing of vegetables and fruits in a farm, including that of agricultural cooperatives, is exempt from PCHF, but is subject to produce safety standards. Is this understanding correct?
So it depends on what kind of cutting and chopping it is. If it's cutting as part of harvesting, then it would be subject to the produce safety rule. So if it's cutting where you're basically, cutting the edible portion away from the crop plant, or if you're cutting to trim the product, or to essentially trim the product, then that would be a farm activity or covered by the farm definition and therefore subject to the produce safety rule. If it's slicing, dicing, chopping, as I explained earlier, that activity would be covered by the preventive controls regulation.
Thank you very much. Next is number 61. Please let us know the typical example of records that a farm should archive. Under FSVP, the records are reviewed by an importer. Is my understanding correct?
With that one, since that's FSVP.
The question was about what records an importer should review of a farm? farms should keep, and the suggestion was
Yeah.
just those that FSPP would require.
Just answer it your way and then we'll.
Well, yeah, I mean, Samir, you can talk about what records the farm needs to keep, but I think I talked about some records like for agricultural water use as well as biological soil amendments. These might be key records that an importer who's doing supplier verification of a farm might need to see if they are conducting supplier verification through review of relevant food safety records. In many cases, we anticipate that there will be an on-site audit of the farm that the importer would need to see the results of. But certainly, in terms of important records that an importer would need to review for what a farm does, those biological soil amendments and the agricultural water would be among the most important.
And just generally speaking, the record-keeping requirements in the produce safety rule apply to in addition to the agricultural water provision area, biological soil amendments provision area, we've got record-keeping requirements around the qualified exemption, similar to those that Jenny described earlier today. Also, there are record-keeping requirements associated with the commercial processing kill step exemption that I described earlier. We have record-keeping requirements associated with training, and I think that essentially completes it. We tried to minimize record-keeping burden associated with the produce safety rule to the extent possible.
Thank you. Number 62. Certifying global gap. Sorry, let me find the question. Which part of Section 105 is covered by accreditation of global gap, and which part is not covered by global gap?
So that's a pretty involved question. We looked at global gap. We looked at multiple schemes in developing the rule, and did an analysis looking at what are these schemes requiring versus just kind of doing a comparative analysis among the various schemes that are out there that impact the production of produce. And I would say that I can't specifically speak to the differences between global gap and the produce safety rule, but there are maybe differences around the agricultural water requirements that we've included in our rule, which are very unique from a lot of the other schemes that we've seen. I don't know if there's anything else that you can think of, Jenny, or anyone else. Yeah, so it's hard to say, what the specific differences are between the global gap scheme and approach, I guess, and our produce safety rule. That's.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to entertain questions from the audience. Anyone with a question? So the last question was very important for Japan, I think. The reason why I say that is, so Japan is now in the process of creating J gap, but global gap is not recognizing the J gap, Japan gap. So Japan gap is becoming more isolated, and we need to solve that problem. And the big issue here is the agricultural water, how we handle it. So it is related to the previous question, but so in the U.S. there is a gap, and And if the US gap recognizes J gap, I think we would be able to resolve this problem. But on the other hand, there is the animal manure issue. We are not familiar with this issue. I think that's also a huge concern as well. So the mutual recognition between US gap and Japan gap. How do you view this issue? Mutual recognition of US gap and J gap.
I'm going to take a stab at this. Right now, we have a gap auditing process in the United States that USDA's Agriculture Market Service does. We are in the process of working with them to modify their gap audits to be consistent with our produce rule. And I think for our purposes, the produce rule is what we are looking for farms to be following when they're producing covered produce. And we're hoping that the various GAPS audits will align with our produce safety standards.
Yeah, we experience the same challenge in the U.S. where growers are subject to multiple schemes, and of course that places a burden on those growers, and so the hope is that eventually all of those schemes will harmonize to the produce safety rule. Again, one step in that direction is to work with the United States Department of Agriculture on its GAPS audit scheme and have that be harmonized with the produce safety rule, and hopefully it'll have a kind of a snowball effect with other schemes to follow.
Yeah. I just want to add that this is also relevant for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program regulation, obviously, because just as we have questions about whether a GFSI audit is going to be adequate for purposes of determining whether a manufacturer processor is complying or is using processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as the preventive controls regulations. Here we have to look at whether JGAP or US GAP, those schemes are going to be reviewing or considering compliance with the produce safety regulations, and so that an importer could rely on the results of such an audit to meet their verification requirements.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes. Please use a microphone. This is similar to question number 66. Testing will be conducted by a registered laboratory. What are the requirements for registration of laboratories? I understand there have not been rules established regarding requirements for laboratory registration, but will these requirements be published together with the guidance and other information? Will it be a registration scheme? Or something like on-site inspection for certifying laboratories? I would like to know about these laboratories.
Staff, Jenny.
Our laboratory accreditation rule is one that is still under development. We have not issued a proposed rule yet or a final rule. They will be coming in the next wave. We have 7 key rules that have to come out first, and the laboratory accreditation will probably be in the next set of standards.
So I would like to take the last question for this session. Any question from the audience, please? So I am a consultant for the food packaging, FSPCA. So I am taking a lecture, a remote lecture from Illinois University, and there is a database of the food packaging at the Illinois University. But as for the produce, packaging, it just says that it should be appropriate packaging, and Illinois Institute of Technology. Is Illinois Institute of Technology conducting a research on the packaging for the produce as well?
Don't know to what extent they're conducting research on food packaging for produce. It certainly falls within their research interest area, but I'm not aware of any specific projects in that regard. That's something we can possibly look into and get back with you about. It definitely falls within their purview, and they certainly are doing several research projects on produce, and they've also done several projects on packaging, as you point out. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a research study or two that has focused on packaging and produce.
Thank you very much. So, one very last question.
最後に
Last question.
農業者の立場から
Well, from a standpoint of farmers,
会議この
it would be nice if the requirements of the FSMA can be met in a simple, easy manner, and that's something I am most interested in. For example, earlier somebody talked about the JGAP accreditation system. For tea, for example, 30% of the growing area is certified, so it's become prevalent. Coca-Cola uses it also. So something like this should be used as a basis, and at the same time meeting requirements of the FSMA. That would be very helpful for farmers in Japan. In the morning session on GFSI accreditation scheme, for example, FSC 22,000, we talked about that. FSSC 22,000, something like this. The scheme owner, for example, looks at alignment with the requirements of FSMA and proves the alignment, then maybe we can see a possibility of using these other schemes, and this should be conducted as the responsibility of the scheme owner. But for proving this, for this purpose, what can the scheme owners do? For example, can the scheme owners submit some kind of document proving that this scheme is in alignment with the FSMA requirements? Some sort of documentation should be submitted. What are your views?
I'll point out what's available in terms of the produce safety rule, and as I mentioned, we do allow for variances where if you show by virtue of your local growing condition and the practices that you implement, they offer the same level of public health protection as what we're requiring in our rule. You could be subject to a variant, or you could get a variance to some or all of the rule requirements, and so that is available if the evidence that you have, the information that you have, suggests that there is equivalence in that regard, or rather, same level of public health protection in that regard. It's a formal petition process where you would submit a foreign country would submit a citizen petition to the United States, and then we would evaluate the information in that petition and make a determination as to whether or not the variance can be offered, or whether or not the variance is achieved. And so, but in terms of other possible approaches or mechanisms. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that.
I'd just like to speak to the point where you asked whether a scheme owner could do a comparison of their scheme with our requirements. And while there is no requirement for this, we would certainly welcome someone to do such an analysis and submit it to us. We would even take a look at their analysis and comment on whether we thought it did indeed show that the scheme was I don't want to say equivalent, but basically that the scheme is consistent with our requirements under the preventive controls rule, under the produce safety rule, of that. So we would certainly welcome that type of effort.
So that's all for Mr. Asaro. Thank you very much for your explanation.